My name is Cassidy Miller, and at 28 years old, I have spent exactly 28 years being the static noise in the background of my father's high-frequency life. Alistair Sterling, a man whose name is etched into the brass directories of 14% of Lower Manhattan's most prestigious commercial real estate, has always measured human worth by the square foot and the interest rate. To him, I was a rounding error, a biological obligation that failed to manifest as a shark in a tailored Italian suit. Standing in the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel on Fifth Avenue for his 60th birthday gala, surrounded by 300 of the most ruthless investors in the tri-state area, I realized that my father didn't just want me to fail, he needed me to fail so that his world remained orderly. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, aged tobacco, and the metallic tang of old money. He stood on the mahogany dais, his 2024 Patek Philippe Grand Complications glistening under the Swarovski chandeliers, swirling a $450 glass of Macallan 25, as if he were stirring the very souls of everyone in the room. He leaned into the microphone, his voice amplified to reach every corner of the 6,000-square-foot space, and fixed his icy blue eyes directly on me. "I'm giving this artisan project of yours exactly 12 months before the sheriff locks the doors and you're back in my foyer with your bags," he said, his tone dripping with a condescending pity that felt like a physical blow. He laughed, a dry, rasping sound, and the audience of sharks followed suit, their collective amusement rippling through the ballroom like a wave of broken glass. He called my business, Miller and Hearth, a cupcake hobby, a whimsical distraction for a daughter who couldn't handle the heat of the boardroom. What he didn't realize was that I was standing there with my iPhone 15 Pro concealed in the lace of my sleeve, recording every single syllable of his arrogance. I wasn't just capturing a speech, I was documenting the beginning of his eviction. Let me take you back to how we reached this moment of public execution. Growing up in a 22,000-square-foot limestone townhouse on the Upper East Side, I learned early on that love was a performance-based incentive. My older brother, Julian, was the golden child who followed Alistair's every command, eventually becoming the senior vice president of Sterling Holdings. I, on the other hand, found my sanctuary in the basement kitchen, a space equipped with a $20,000 La Cornue Grand Palais 180 range that the house staff used more than my mother ever did. While my father was busy negotiating the acquisition of a 40-story office tower on Water Street, I was teaching myself the chemistry of sugar and the structural integrity of laminated dough. I saw the world in textures and temperatures. By the time I was 22, I had a degree in architecture from Columbia University, but I didn't want to build glass boxes for corporations. I wanted to build edible monuments that told stories. When I told my father I was turning down a position at a top-tier firm to open a boutique patisserie in Chelsea, he didn't just disagree, he systematically tried to starve me out. He cut off my trust fund, which held $350,000 intended for my stabilization, and told every landlord he knew in Manhattan that I was a credit risk. He thought that by closing the doors of the city to me, I would crawl back to the foyer of the townhouse and accept the life of a bored socialite he had mapped out for me. But Alistair Sterling forgot one crucial detail about the architecture he taught me. The strongest structures are built under immense pressure. I spent 3 years working 18-hour days as a line cook and a baker's assistant at 3 different locations, saving every cent of my $62,000 annual salary. I lived in a 400-square-foot studio in Queens where the radiator hissed like a dying animal and the rent was $2,800 a month. I ate the scraps of broken croissants and day-old sourdough so I could afford to buy a commercial-grade Hobart mixer and a deck oven. By the time I finally secured the lease for my own space, a small, sun-drenched corner on West 18th Street, I had developed a spine of tempered steel. My father didn't know that my cupcake hobby was actually a high-end pastry architecture firm that catered to the very same elite clientele he entertained. I wasn't just selling sweets, I was selling exclusive, edible art pieces for $500 a plate. I was building a brand that the elite of New York were whispering about in the hallways of the same clubs he frequented. The night of the gala was supposed to be his ultimate triumph, a celebration of 6 decades of dominance. He had spent over $80,000 on the catering alone, excluding the wine. As I stood there, listening to him mock me in front of his peers, I felt a strange sense of calm. He was so blinded by his own reflection in the gold-leafed mirrors that he couldn't see the reality of the market shifting beneath his feet. He didn't know that 3 of the investors in that room had already approached me about a $15 million expansion plan for Miller and Hearth. He didn't know that the signature dessert being served at his own birthday dinner, a complex, multi-layered chocolate sphere that collapsed into a gold-dusted raspberry center when drizzled with warm sea salt caramel, was my creation. I had ghost-catered the event through a third-party luxury firm specifically to see his face when he tasted it. I watched him take a bite, his eyes momentarily widening at the perfection of the texture, the way the Valrhona Guanaja 70% dark chocolate melted against the sharpness of the fruit. He praised the caterer, a man named Marcus who worked for me, and even shook his hand, telling him it was the finest thing he'd eaten in a decade. The irony was a delicious, heavy weight in my chest. After the speech, the room devolved into the usual post-gala networking, a choreographed dance of ego and influence. I retreated to the shadows near the bar, watching as my father held court. He was holding a glass of the Macallan, the amber liquid catching the light, looking every bit the king of a crumbling empire. He saw me standing there and gestured for me to come over, his face flushed with the pride of a man who had successfully asserted his dominance. "Well, Cassidy, don't look so glum," he said, his voice loud enough for the nearby group to hear. "I'm only telling you the truth because I'm the only one who cares enough to be honest. This world doesn't reward hobbies. It rewards assets. And right now, you're a liability." I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see a giant. I saw a man who was terrified of anything he couldn't own or control. I didn't argue. I didn't defend my business. I simply reached into my clutch, pulled out a small, velvet-lined box containing a single, perfectly crafted macaron, painted with the Sterling Holdings logo in edible gold leaf. "Consider this a gift for your 60th, I said, my voice steady and quiet, a reminder of what a hobby can do. He took the box with a smirk, popping the macaron into his mouth before even looking at it properly. As he chewed, I saw the realization hit him. The flavor profile was a direct replica of the birthday cake his mother used to make him before she passed away. A specific blend of almond, Meyer lemon, and a hint of lavender that he hadn't tasted in 45 years. It was a sensory precision he couldn't fathom. For a split second, the mask of the ruthless billionaire slipped, and I saw the boy who had once been human. But then the steel returned. "Very clever," he whispered, leaning in so only I could hear. "But nostalgia doesn't pay the rent on 18th Street. I'm giving you until the end of the fiscal year. Enjoy the play acting while it lasts." He walked away, leaving me standing by the bar, but I wasn't defeated. I pulled out my phone and checked the recording. It was crystal clear. Every word of his public humiliation, every insult aimed at my professional integrity was saved. In the world of high-stakes real estate and public relations, a recording of a powerful man bullying his daughter at a public event is more than just drama. It's a tactical nuke. I left the Pierre Hotel that night and walked into the crisp, cool air of Fifth Avenue. I headed toward the curb where my black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe High Country was waiting, the engine idling with a low, powerful hum. My driver, a man named Elias who had been with me since I opened my first shop, opened the door, his face neutral. "Home, Miss Miller?" he asked. "No, Elias. Take me to the office," I replied. "I have some emails to send." As we drove through the city, the lights of the skyscrapers blurring into long, glowing ribbons against the dark glass, I thought about the 12-month deadline my father had set. He thought he was counting down the days until my failure. He didn't realize he was counting down the days until I took over the one thing he valued more than his life, his reputation. By the time we reached Chelsea, I had already drafted the first press release, I wasn't just a pastry architect. I was a businesswoman who understood the power of a narrative. My father had spent his life building walls to keep people out, but I had spent mine learning how to make things crumble exactly when and how I wanted them to. The sheriff wasn't going to be locking my doors. He was going to be delivering the papers that would end Alistair Sterling's reign of terror. Family isn't about the name on the deed or the money in the trust. It's about the respect you earn when you stop asking for permission to exist. I was no longer the girl in the background. I was the architect of my own destiny, and the foundation I had built was far stronger than anything my father had ever imagined. The game had officially changed, and I was the one holding the remote. The lights of Manhattan flickered in the rearview mirror, a city of glass and steel that was about to find out exactly what a cupcake hobby could achieve when it was fueled by 30 years of silence and a perfectly timed recording. The physical and financial distance between my reality and the world of the Sterlings was not just a gap, but a vast, unbridgeable canyon that seemed to widen with every breath I took in that suffocating ballroom. My father, Alistair Sterling, had spent exactly $112,000 on this single night at the Pierre Hotel, a sum that could have funded my entire bakery's operations for 2 years. Yet to him, it was merely the cost of maintaining a certain social atmospheric pressure. As I stood on the periphery of the gilded circle, I felt the crushing weight of that disparity in every fiber of my being. My older brother, Bennett, who was 31 and the living embodiment of our father's cold-blooded legacy, stood at the center of a group of private equity vultures in a $4,500 Tom Ford tuxedo that fit him like a second skin. He was mid-sentence, his voice carrying that peculiar tone of inherited authority as he boasted about a $20 million tech acquisition in the logistics sector, gesturing with a hand that had never known a day of manual labor. His skin was perfectly tanned from a recent weekend in St. Bart's, and his teeth were a blinding porcelain white that only top-tier Manhattan cosmetic dentistry can produce. In stark, almost humiliating contrast, I was standing there in a $45 vintage wrap dress I had found in a thrift store in Bushwick 3 months ago, its fabric thin and slightly frayed at the hem where I had tried to stitch it back together by hand. My own hands were the greatest betrayal of my status. While the women around me flaunted $500 manicures and diamond rings the size of quail eggs, my cuticles were stained a deep, stubborn crimson from the organic hibiscus powder I had been hand-sifting for 14 hours straight to prepare the signature floral tarts for the evening's hidden catering contract. No matter how much I scrubbed with lemon juice and baking soda in my cramped stainless steel sink, the mark of my trade remained, a scarlet brand that shouted my labor to anyone who dared to look closely. While my father and Bennett traded jargon about asset allocation, tax shelters in the Cayman Islands, and the EBITDA of their latest holdings, my mind was 3 miles away in my kitchen on West 18th Street, trapped in a spiral of anxiety over a $1,200 repair bill for my primary industrial convection oven. To them, $1,200 was a tip for a sommelier or the cost of a round of appetizers at Carbone, but to me, it was the difference between meeting my morning delivery deadlines and losing my most important wholesale account. The heating element had burned out at 4 a.m. while I was mid-bake, and the sound of that mechanical failure had felt like a gunshot to my heart. I was the Sterling family's ultimate budget error, the daughter who had inexplicably chosen the volatile world of flour and yeast over the predictable, high-margin world of finance. To Alistair, my career was a mathematical insult, a refusal to multiply the capital he had provided through my education, and to Bennett, I was a cautionary tale of what happens when you let passion override the bottom line. They moved through the world in a bubble of extreme liquidity, where every problem could be solved by a wire transfer, while I navigated a world of razor-thin margins where every ounce of Madagascar vanilla bean was a calculated risk. I watched as a waiter passed by with a silver tray of Bollinger La Grande Année, realizing that a single bottle of the vintage they were swilling would cover the cost of the specialized gaskets I needed for my proofing cabinet. The unfairness of it wasn't just in the numbers. It was in the way they looked through me as if I were a piece of the hotel's period furniture, something that belonged to the room but held no intrinsic value to the conversation. Bennett caught my eye briefly, a smirk playing on his lips as he adjusted his onyx cufflinks, and I could see the silent calculation in his gaze. He was measuring my worth and finding it wanting, just as he had since we were children. He leaned in toward a prospective partner and whispered something that caused the whole group to chuckle, their eyes darting toward my thrift store dress for a fraction of a second before returning to the more important business of wealth accumulation. I felt the sting of it, the familiar burn of being the other in a family that prized uniformity and power above all else. But as I stood there, my fingers tracing the hidden iPhone in my pocket, I reminded myself that their wealth was a fortress built on sand and ego, while mine was built on the tangible sensory mastery of my craft. They understood the price of everything and the value of nothing, whereas I knew the exact weight of a perfect macaron shell and the precise temperature at which sugar transforms from a solid to a liquid amber. I was a pastry architect, a title they laughed at, but while they moved numbers around on digital ledgers, I was creating something that people could actually feel, taste, and remember. My father's 12-month ultimatum was a ticking clock, yes, but it was also a deadline for my own liberation. I wasn't just the girl who chose flour over finance. I was the one who had learned how to feed the very people he spent his life trying to impress. Every time Bennett laughed, I thought about the sweat and the sheer physical toll of my cupcake hobby. He didn't know about the 5-gallon buckets of flour I hauled up a flight of stairs because the service elevator was broken. He didn't know about the burns on my forearms from the 450-degree oven racks, marks I hid under long sleeves even in the humid New York summers. To him, money was an abstract concept that grew in the dark. But to me, money was a direct conversion of my own physical energy and time. He had his Tom Ford tuxedo and his $20 million deal, but he had never built anything with his own 2 hands. He was a manager of shadows, while I was a creator of substance. As the gala continued, the air grew even more oppressive, filled with the self-congratulatory hum of the 1%. I watched my father take a sip of his Macallan, the same man who once told me that if I couldn't be an asset, I was a liability. He was so convinced that my financial struggle was a sign of weakness, failing to realize that it was actually my training ground. The $1,200 I owed the repairman weighed more heavily on my mind than the millions Bennett was tossing around because that $1,200 represented my independence. If I paid that bill, I remained my own boss. If I asked my father for it, I became his property again. The choice was never a choice at all. Standing in that ballroom, surrounded by the elite of Manhattan, I realized that I was the only person in the room who truly understood the cost of a dream. My father's gala was a monument to his past, a celebration of what he had already taken from the world, while my stained cuticles and cheap dress were the blueprint for my future. I wasn't interested in being a line item in his ledger anymore. I was ready to be the architect who designed his obsolescence. The hibiscus powder on my skin was a badge of honor, a sign that I had spent my day working while they had spent theirs preening. As the night wore on and the speeches became more grandiose, I felt a strange sense of power. I was the ghost in their machine, the secret ingredient in their celebration that they were too arrogant to recognize. I would take the 12 months my father gave me, and I would use every second to ensure that by the time the clock ran out, I wouldn't be the one looking for a place to stay. He thought he was giving me a grace period. In reality, he was giving me a head start. The canyon between us was wide, but I was the only one who knew how to build a bridge, and I was going to make sure that when he finally tried to cross it, the toll would be more than he could ever afford to pay. Family, in the Sterling household, was a transaction, and I was finally ready to settle the debt on my own terms, with no more excuses and no more silence. I was Cassidy Miller, and I was about to prove that flour was a far more stable foundation than finance could ever hope to be. The glittering chandeliers overhead suddenly seemed dim compared to the fire of my own resolve. I watched my father toast to another decade of dominance, his face flushed with the easy confidence of a man who has never been told no. I thought about the small, cramped kitchen in Chelsea, the smell of burnt sugar, the hum of the broken oven, and the sheer, unadulterated joy I felt when a customer took their first bite of my work and their eyes lit up with genuine wonder. That was a currency Alistair Sterling would never understand. He dealt in acquisitions. I dealt in transformations. As I turned to leave the ballroom, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind me and muffling the sound of Bennett's boastful laughter, I didn't feel like a budget error. I felt like a revolution in a $45 dress. The cool night air of Fifth Avenue hit my face, and I took a deep breath. The scent of the city, exhaust, rain, and street food, filling my lungs. It was the smell of the real world, the world where I lived and worked and struggled, and for the first time in my life I felt completely at home in it. The Pierre Hotel was a gilded cage, and I had just walked out of the door with the key in my pocket. Tomorrow the repairman would come for the oven, and I would find the $1,200 even if I had to work 48 hours straight. I would find it because I had to, and because every dollar I earned without my father's help was another brick in the wall I was building between his world and mine. The 12-month countdown had begun, and as I walked toward the subway, my hibiscus-stained fingers gripping my bag, I knew that I wasn't just going to survive. I was going to redefine what it meant to be a Sterling, even if I had to burn the whole empire down to do it. The betrayal did not happen in a back alley or a dark corner, but rather in the most fortified sanctuary of the Manhattan elite, the VIP lounge of the Pierre Hotel, at exactly 10:42 p.m. I remember the time with clinical precision because I looked at the wall clock, a bespoke masterpiece of brushed gold and silent gears, just as my father, Alistair Sterling, gathered his top 3 associates around him like a king summoning his dark council. These were men who controlled billions in infrastructure and global logistics, individuals whose casual whispers could fluctuate the closing prices of the S&P 500. And they stood there with their legs braced and their chests out, radiating an almost radioactive level of self-importance. The air in the lounge was thick, an oppressive mixture of heavy, cedar-scented humidors, the smoky vanilla of $1,000 cigars, and the sharp, antiseptic tang of pure, unadulterated arrogance. My father leaned back against a velvet-tufted armchair, his face flushed with the kind of expansive cruelty that only comes after 3 fingers of Macallan and a room full of sycophants. He didn't lower his voice as I approached. Instead, he raised it, using his hand to gesture toward me as if I were a piece of faulty office equipment he was contemplating returning to the manufacturer. "Cassidy is our little tax write-off," he chuckled, the sound vibrating through the expensive fabric of his suit and into the very floorboards beneath my feet. He looked at the men around him, men who had known me since I was a child in pigtails, and he laughed with a jagged, hollow mirth that made my skin crawl. "She actually thinks baking is a career, a pursuit worthy of the Sterling name," he continued, his eyes glinting with a predatory sharpness. "I've already instructed my legal team at Sterling & Associates to prepare a junior analyst desk for her by next Christmas, tucked away in the back of the acquisitions department where she can't do any real damage. She'll fail, of course, because while she's a Miller by blood, she lacks the predatory instinct required to survive in the ecosystem we've built." The room erupted in a synchronized wave of laughter that felt like a physical assault, a cacophony of deep, gravelly barks from men who found the idea of a woman creating something with her hands to be the ultimate punchline. My brother, Bennett, stood just to my father's right, adjusting the heavy weight of his $12,000 Rolex Cosmograph Daytona with a practiced flick of his wrist, his smirk so wide and genuine that I could see the triumph dancing in his eyes. He wasn't just enjoying the joke, he was savoring the destruction of my professional identity. They weren't just insulting my talent or my work ethic. In that one concentrated moment of public humiliation, they were systematically blacklisting me from every private equity contact and venture capital source in the entire city of New York. My father was signaling to the gatekeepers of the financial world that I was a liability, a flighty girl with a flower-dusted hobby who was to be humored but never, under any circumstances, funded. I watched as the men nodded to one another, a silent agreement being forged in the haze of cigar smoke that my name would never be mentioned in a serious boardroom again. The realization should have broken me, should have sent me running from the room in a fit of tears, but instead, I felt a strange, icy calm settle over my heart. A temperature drop so profound it matched the winter air waiting for me outside. I stood there for a heartbeat longer, watching my father take another sip of his scotch, his throat moving as he swallowed the liquid gold, completely unaware that he had just handed me the final piece of motivation I needed to dismantle his world. I didn't say a word in response because words are for those who still believe they can be heard, and I knew that in this room I was already a ghost. I turned on my heel, the hem of my $45 thrift store dress swishing against my legs, and walked past the marble columns and the silent, judging waitstaff toward the heavy brass doors of the hotel. I didn't look back at Bennett, who was likely already pivoting the conversation toward a new commercial development in Long Island City. And I didn't look back at Alistair, the man who saw my humanity as a line item to be deleted. As I stepped out of the pier and onto the sidewalk, the 28-degree night air hit me like a splash of cold water, searing my lungs and clearing the last of the cigar smoke from my senses. The street was quiet, the usual roar of Manhattan reduced to a low, rhythmic hum, and the sidewalk was dusted with a fine layer of frost that glittered under the high-pressure sodium streetlights like scattered diamonds. I stood there on the corner of 5th Avenue and 61st Street, my breath blooming in white clouds before me, and realized that my father was right about one thing. I didn't have his predatory instinct. I had something much more dangerous. I had the patience of an architect and the precision of a chemist. He wanted me at a desk by next Christmas, a domesticated failure he could trot out at holidays to prove his own superiority. But he had no idea that by next Christmas, I wouldn't be looking for a desk. I would be looking for a way to buy the very building he stood in. The icy wind whipped around the corners of the buildings, pulling the warmth from my skin, but I welcomed the bite of it because it reminded me that I was still alive, still capable of feeling something beyond the suffocating numbness of the Sterling townhouse. I reached into my pocket and felt the cool, smooth glass of my iPhone, the recording of his speech sitting there like a loaded weapon. He had called me a tax write-off in front of the 3 most powerful men in his inner circle, effectively declaring war on my future, but he had forgotten that I was the one who knew how to balance the ingredients. I knew exactly how much heat it took to make a structure collapse and how much sugar it took to mask the taste of poison. As I walked toward the dark silhouette of my 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe High Country parked a block away, my boots crunching on the frozen grit of the New York pavement, I began to map out the next 12 months not as a struggle for survival, but as a masterpiece of calculated retribution. He thought he had blacklisted me, but all he had really done was ensure that when I finally succeeded, it would be entirely on my terms, with no debt owed to his name or his shadow. I climbed into the driver's seat, the leather cold against my legs, and stared out the windshield at the skyline that my father claimed to own. The skyscrapers reached up like jagged teeth into the black sky, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small beneath them. I felt like the person who was going to teach them what it truly meant to build something from nothing. The 12-month clock wasn't just ticking for me, it was ticking for Alistair Sterling. He had given me a year to fail, but I was going to give him a year to realize that he had underestimated the very person who had spent 28 years studying his every weakness. I put the Tahoe into gear, the engine purring with a controlled mechanical hunger, and pulled away from the curb. The lights of the Pierre Hotel faded in the rearview mirror, a glowing monument to a dynasty that was about to find out that the most dangerous enemies are the ones you've raised in your own home and then told they were worthless. I headed south toward Chelsea, toward my small, dark kitchen where the smell of yeast and hibiscus still lingered in the air, a place where I was the architect and the law. My father wanted a predator, But he was going to get a craftsman who understood that the finest revenge is a dish served at exactly the right temperature, with a texture so perfect you don't even realize it's falling apart until it's too late to save. The winter night was long and unforgiving, but as I drove through the heart of the city, I felt a fire starting to burn in the pit of my stomach, a heat that no 28-degree wind could ever extinguish. This was no longer about a cupcake hobby or a boutique patisserie. This was about the total and absolute reclamation of my own life. Family isn't the people who share your blood while planning your demise. Family is the bridge you burn to make sure the past can never catch up with you. I was Cassidy Miller, and the countdown to Alistair Sterling's obsolescence had officially reached its first hour. Every mile I drove away from the Pierre felt like a layer of lead being stripped from my shoulders. The sheer audacity of his plan, to relegate me to a junior analyst desk as if I were a child playing at business, was the final insult that severed the last thread of my loyalty. I thought about the legal team he mentioned, the men in gray suits who would try to draft the paperwork of my surrender, and I smiled in the darkness of the SUV. They would find that my books were cleaner than his, my margins more honest, and my resolve more durable than any commercial lease agreement he had ever signed. He believed that because I chose the sensory world of baking, I lacked the intellectual rigor for the real world. But he forgot that a bakery is just a laboratory where the stakes are immediate and the feedback is visceral. If a soufflé falls, there is no insurance payout. If a tempering goes wrong, you lose the entire batch. I had lived in that high-stakes environment every day while he hid behind a phalanx of assistants and lawyers. I pulled my Tahoe up to a red light at 23rd Street, looking at the people crossing the street, ordinary New Yorkers living their lives in the margins of his empire, and I felt a deep, resonant connection to them. I was one of them now, truly and completely, and that gave me a power he could never understand. I was no longer a Sterling. I was a builder. And a builder knows that before you can create something beautiful, you often have to clear the site of the rot that came before it. The 10:42 p.m. betrayal was the spark. The 28-degree night was the tempering, and the next 12 months would be the construction of a new reality where the name Cassidy Miller meant something far more than a tax write-off or a budget error. It would mean the woman who broke the Sterling Bank with nothing but sugar, steel, and a recording of the truth. I sat in my 450-square-foot studio apartment in Bedford-Stuyvesant, a space that felt like a pressure cooker of ambition and resentment, illuminated only by the flickering, sterile blue light of my 2023 MacBook Pro. Outside the single, drafty window, the sounds of the G train rumbling beneath Lafayette Avenue and the distant, rhythmic thumping of a neighbor's sound system provided the soundtrack to my descent into the digital underworld of Sterling Holdings. I opened a password-encrypted spreadsheet I had titled Project Zero, a name that felt increasingly appropriate because it represented the point from which I would rebuild my life and the point to which I intended to reduce my father's legacy. For 3 hours, I navigated through layers of shell companies and nested LLCs, my eyes straining against the glow as I performed a forensic audit of the man who had just called me a tax write-off. As I dug deeper into the public filings and the leaked internal memos I had spent months quietly collecting, the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Alistair Sterling's empire was not the monolithic fortress of granite and steel he projected to the world, but a precarious house of cards built on a foundation of high-interest commercial loans and predatory refinancing. The centerpiece of his vanity, the Sterling Plaza on Water Street, was hemorrhaging cash due to a massive underwater lease agreement and a staggering vacancy rate that he was desperately hiding from his primary lenders at J.P. Morgan Chase. He wasn't the master of the universe. He was a man running out of breath on a treadmill of mounting debt, and for the first time in 28 years, I realized that I didn't need his love, his approval, or his seat at the table. I needed his liabilities. The air in the apartment was cold, the radiator giving off a pathetic metallic hiss that barely touched the chill, but I didn't feel it because my focus was entirely on a weathered, leather-bound ledger I had pulled from the bottom of a locked trunk beneath my bed. This was my mother's old ledger, a relic from a time before the cancer took her, back when she was the silent, brilliant architect of the original Miller fortune before Alistair absorbed it into his own brand and erased her contribution. My mother, Eleanor Miller, had been a woman who understood the importance of a contingency plan, and as I flipped through the handwritten pages filled with her elegant, precise script, I found the coordinates for my salvation. Hidden within the fine print of an offshore maritime insurance settlement was a private $200,000 insurance bond tucked away in a Cayman Islands trust that Alistair, in all his arrogant oversight, had failed to discover or touch during the probate of her estate. It was a dormant seed she had planted specifically for me, a financial lifeline designed to be pulled only when the water reached my neck. I stared at the account numbers and the digital confirmation of the bond's current valuation, and a profound, silent shift occurred within my soul. $200,000 was not just a sum of money. In my hands, it was a tactical advantage that could be leveraged into a $10 million line of credit if played with the right level of ruthlessness. I looked at the flickering cursor on my screen and realized that the daughter who chose flour over finance was about to use the very tools of his trade to dismantle him from the inside out. I had enough capital to transition from the prey to the hunter, and the architectural precision I used to construct a 1,000-layer puff pastry was about to be applied to the structural demolition of Alistair Sterling's ego. I leaned back in my creaky wooden chair, the kind of furniture Alistair wouldn't even allow in his guest quarters, and watched the digital clock on my desktop flip to 3:14 a.m. The silence of the apartment was heavy, filled with the ghosts of every time I had been told I wasn't enough, every time Bennett had smirked at my thrift store clothes, and every time my father had used my name as a punchline for a joke about failure. They thought I was playing at a career, but they didn't understand that the discipline required to master the chemistry of baking, the patience to wait for the fermentation, the precision to measure to the microgram, the endurance to stand on your feet for 20 hours, is the exact same discipline required to execute a corporate raid. I began to map out the vulnerabilities in the Sterling Plaza's debt structure, noting the specific dates when his balloon payments were due and the clauses in his contracts that allowed for a hostile takeover if the debt-to-equity ratio fell below a certain threshold. My mother had taught me how to read the fine print before she taught me how to read a recipe, and her ledger was a roadmap to every corner Alistair had cut to maintain his image. I saw the $20 million tech acquisition Bennett had been bragging about at the Pierre for what it really was: a desperate, high-risk pivot to distract investors from the fact that their core real estate assets were rotting from the inside. They were over-leveraged, arrogant, and blind to the girl in the Bed-Stuy studio who was currently holding the match to their paper kingdom. I spent the next several hours drafting a series of letters of intent under the name of a blind trust, using the Cayman funds as the initial deposit to secure a meeting with a distressed asset firm that had been eyeing Sterling's portfolio for years. Every keystroke felt like a brick being removed from the base of my father's tower. I thought about the hibiscus powder on my fingers and the $1,200 oven repair bill, and I laughed, a low, sharp sound that startled me in the quiet room. To them, I was a budget error, but in reality, I was the only one in the family who knew the actual value of $1 because I was the only one who had ever had to earn one. Alistair had spent his life accumulating things, but I had spent mine accumulating knowledge, and as I watched the sun begin to bleed a pale, gray light over the rooftops of Brooklyn, I knew that the 12-month clock was no longer a countdown to my eviction. It was a countdown to his. I wasn't just going to pay my oven bill, I was going to buy the company that manufactured the oven, and then I was going to buy the building my father worked in, and I was going to do it all while he still thought I was looking for a junior analyst desk. The power dynamic had shifted in the darkness of that studio apartment, and as I finally closed my laptop, the Apple logo glowing one last time before fading to black, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known since I was a child. The hunt had begun, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the monster under the bed because I realized the monster was me. I stood up and walked to the small kitchenette, the linoleum floor cold under my bare feet, and began the familiar, meditative process of measuring out flour and water for my morning bake. As I moved through the motions, my mind was racing with the technicalities of the Cayman Trust and the specific legal loopholes I would need to jump through to remain anonymous until the final moment of impact. My father always said that I lacked the predatory instinct, but he failed to realize that a predator doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just waits for the winter to weaken the herd. I thought about the Pierre Hotel, the $112,000 gala, and the $45 dress I had worn like a shroud, and I realized that my poverty had been my greatest disguise. It allowed me to move through their world unnoticed, to listen to their secrets while they treated me like the help, and to gather the intelligence I needed to strike. By the time I was finished with the first batch of dough, the sun was fully up, casting long, sharp shadows across the room that looked like the blueprints of a new empire. I was no longer Cassidy Miller, the disgraced daughter. I was the ghost in the machine of Sterling Holdings, the silent partner in my father's downfall. I would take his 12 months and turn them into a lifetime of regret for every word he had spoken at that podium. The ledger sat on the table, its worn edges a reminder of the woman who had truly built the life Alistair enjoyed, and I placed my hand on it as if I could draw some of her strength through the leather. She had known this day would come, had known that Alistair's greed would eventually outpace his common sense, and she had left me the keys to the kingdom. I thought about the sheriff he mentioned, the one he expected to lock my doors, and I pictured that same sheriff handing Alistair the notice of foreclosure on the Sterling Plaza. The irony was so perfect it was almost poetic. I would continue to wear my thrift store dresses and stain my hands with hibiscus powder. I would continue to struggle with my repair bills and work until my back screamed in protest, but I would do it all with the knowledge that I was the wealthiest person in any room I walked into. Not because of the $200,000 in the Cayman Islands, but because I had the one thing Alistair and Bennett would never have: the truth. I was the architect of the end of the Sterling era, and as I looked out at the waking city, I saw not a maze of glass and steel, but a playground of opportunity. Family is the foundation you build on, but when the foundation is rotten, the only thing left to do is clear the site and start over. I was ready to start over, and this time, the name Sterling would be nothing more than a footnote in the story of Cassidy Miller's rise to power. The blue light of the MacBook was gone, replaced by the golden light of a new day, and as I took my first sip of bitter black coffee, I knew that the game was already won. They just didn't know it yet. The next phase of my architectural demolition required a specialist whose soul was as cold as the numbers he manipulated. So I hired Julian Vance, a forensic auditor with a legendary reputation for finding the bodies buried in corporate ledgers and a $750 per hour retainer that consumed my savings like a high-speed furnace. We met in his dimly lit office in Dumbo, a space tucked away in a converted 19th century warehouse where the air was heavy with the scent of decomposing paper, industrial dust, and the sharp, acidic aroma of a bitter, dark roast coffee that seemed to be the only thing keeping him tethered to the physical world. The office looked out over the East River, the Manhattan Bridge casting a jagged, geometric shadow across his desk as the sun dipped behind the skyline my father claimed to rule. Without a word of greeting, Julian slid a thick, weather-beaten manila folder across the scarred oak surface, a folder containing 48 pages of meticulously documented bank records, wire transfer trails, and the one secret that would act as the keystone to Alistair Sterling's collapse. He leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the dull glow of his monitors, and explained that the ground lease for my father's prestigious headquarters at Sterling Plaza was being quietly put up for sale due to a sudden, forced bank liquidation in Luxembourg that Alistair assumed was still a confidential matter. This was the ultimate structural flaw. Alistair owned the steel and the glass of the tower, but he did not own the dirt it sat upon, and if that ground lease changed hands, the man who called me a tax write-off would suddenly find himself paying rent to a ghost. I spent the next 3 months living a life of calculated monastic deprivation, existing in my drafty Bed-Stuy studio on a budget of exactly $4 a day, which usually manifested as instant ramen seasoned with the leftover spices from my bakery and tap water that tasted like the old lead pipes of Brooklyn. Every single cent of the $200,000 insurance bond from my mother's Cayman trust, along with every penny of profit from the 18-hour days I spent slogging at Miller and Hearth, was funneled into a labyrinthine anonymous LLC I had registered in Delaware under the name Aura Holdings. I became a phantom in my own life, a woman who wore the same thrift store coat every day and skipped meals to ensure that my capital was ready for the moment the auction opened. I watched my bank balance fluctuate with the manic energy of a heartbeat, poring over the notarized deeds and the legal descriptions of the Water Street property until I could recite the metes and bounds of the land in my sleep. While my father was likely at the Harvard Club discussing his next imaginary acquisition, I was sitting on my floor in the dark, double-checking the routing numbers for the 10 o'clock a.m. time-stamped wire transfer confirmations that would finalize my bid for the ground lease. The physical toll was immense. My skin grew pale from the lack of sunlight and nutrition, and my hands, once steady enough to pipe intricate lace onto a wedding cake, now trembled slightly from the sheer adrenaline of the gamble I was taking. The transition from the world of artisan pastry to the world of predatory real estate was seamless because the stakes were identical. If you miss one detail, if the temperature is off by a single degree, or the filing is late by a single minute, the entire structure fails. I lived in a state of hypervigilance, my MacBook Pro becoming an extension of my own nervous system as I tracked the liquidation proceedings through Julian's back-channel contacts. I moved through the city like a shadow, taking the subway at odd hours to avoid being seen by anyone from my former life, my mind a constant loop of interest rates and leasehold interest calculations. The $1,200 oven repair bill I had worried about months ago now seemed like a relic from a different century. I was now playing a game where the moving parts were measured in millions, and the margin for error was non-existent. I gathered the notarized signatures from the offshore trustees, each stamp of the notary's seal sounding like a hammer hitting a nail into the coffin of my father's arrogance. By the end of the second month, Aura Holdings was no longer just a name on a digital filing. It was a fully funded financial predator waiting in the tall grass for Alistair Sterling to wander into the clearing. I remember the morning the wire transfer finally cleared, the digital confirmation appearing on my screen with a cold, mechanical finality that made my breath hitch in my chest. It was exactly 10 o'clock a.m., and at that moment, the dirt beneath the Sterling Plaza, the very ground my father walked on every morning when he arrived at his corner office, belonged to me. He was still occupying the space, still issuing orders to his subordinates and staring out his floor-to-ceiling windows at the harbor, completely oblivious to the fact that the foundation of his world had just shifted beneath his Italian leather loafers. I looked at the confirmation code, a string of 24 alphanumeric characters that represented the total reclamation of my dignity, and I didn't feel a surge of joy. I felt a profound, heavy sense of duty. My mother's ledger lay open on the desk beside me, the ink of her handwriting a reminder that this was not just my victory, but hers as well. She had provided the seed, and I had provided the fire, and together we had built something that Alistair could never understand because he viewed everything through the lens of ego, while we viewed it through the lens of survival. In those 3 months of ramen and silence, I learned more about the nature of power than I ever had in the 28 years of being a Sterling. Power isn't the gala at the Pierre, and it isn't the $12,000 Rolex on Bennett's wrist. Power is the ability to endure the darkness and the cold while you wait for your opponent to make a mistake. My father had made the mistake of assuming that my labor was a weakness, that my stained cuticles and my cheap clothes were the marks of a failure, when in reality, they were the camouflage that allowed me to get close enough to cut the throat of his empire. I spent my nights in the Bed-Stuy studio listening to the neighborhood wake up, the sounds of people heading to work at the hospital or the grocery store, and I felt a fierce pride in the fact that I was one of them. I was a worker who had used her wages to buy a kingdom. The 48 pages of bank records in Julian Vance's folder were the blueprints for a new world order, and as I tucked them into my own backpack, I felt the weight of them like a shield. I returned to my bakery that afternoon, the smell of fermenting sourdough and roasted nuts greeting me like an old friend, and I went straight to work. I had to keep up the appearance of the struggling cupcake hobbyist for just a little while longer. I kneaded the dough with a newfound strength, my muscles remembering the effort of the last 3 months, and I realized that every loaf I sold was now contributing to the maintenance of the land I owned. The irony was exquisite. Every time my father's company paid its monthly operating expenses, a portion of that money would eventually trickle through the various holding companies and end up in the Aura Holdings account. He was effectively paying me to destroy him, and he was doing it with a smile on his face and a glass of Macallan in his hand. I spent the evening preparing a batch of yuzu and black sesame tarts, the precision of the flavors mirroring the precision of the legal trap I had set. I was no longer the daughter who was waiting for a junior analyst desk. I was the landlord of the man who had tried to evict me from his heart. The winter had begun to fade into a damp, gray New York spring, but the icy calm that had settled over me in the VIP lounge of the Pierre remained. I was focused on the final phase of Project Zero, the moment when the mask would finally come off and Alistair would have to look me in the eye and acknowledge that he had lost. I had the deeds, I had the wire confirmations, and most importantly, I had the recording of his birthday speech, a digital testament to the man he truly was. I thought about Bennett and the way he adjusted his cuffs, and I wondered how he would feel when he realized that his $20 million tech acquisition was sitting in a building owned by the sister he mocked. The Sterling name was about to become synonymous with a catastrophic failure of oversight, and the name Miller, my mother's name, my name, was going to be the only thing left standing in the ruins. I looked at the clock on the bakery wall, the second hand ticking forward with a relentless, rhythmic certainty, and I knew that the 12-month deadline was no longer a threat. It was a promise. I walked out to my black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe High Country, the vehicle now a mobile command center for a woman who was living a double life. I sat in the driver's seat and looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror, seeing the tired eyes and the messy hair of a baker, but also seeing the sharp, predatory glint of an owner. My father had wanted me to have a predatory instinct, and now he was going to get exactly what he asked for, though not in the way he expected. I was the architect who had found the flaw in the foundation, the daughter who had turned flour into fire, and the hunter who had finally cornered the lion. The ground lease was mine, the debt was mounting, and the silence of my 3-month vigil was about to be broken by the sound of a dynasty crumbling into the dirt of Manhattan. Family isn't who you're born to. Family is who you honor with your actions. And as I drove through the night toward the dark towers of the financial district, I knew that I was finally honoring the woman who had left me the ledger and the strength to use it. The countdown was entering its final stage, and the air was thick with the scent of an impending storm that would wash the Sterling name away forever, leaving only the truth behind in the light of the new morning. The setup for the final confrontation was a masterpiece of atmospheric irony, a carefully choreographed display of the very wealth I was about to dismantle. My father was hosting what he called a victory brunch on the rooftop terrace of the Sterling Plaza, a sprawling 3,000-square-foot space that offered an unobstructed 360-degree view of the Manhattan skyline and the churning gray waters of the East River. It was a crisp, clear morning with the temperature hovering at a perfect 55 degrees, the kind of autumn air that feels sharp and expensive against the skin. 60 of his most elite clients, the men and women who formed the backbone of his influence, were gathered around long tables draped in Belgian linen, the silver service clinking rhythmically against fine bone china. My father, Alistair Sterling, was at the absolute zenith of his pride, celebrating the 30th anniversary of Sterling Holdings while wearing a custom-tailored Brioni suit in a shade of midnight navy that likely cost more than my first 3 delivery vans combined. He looked every bit the king of the mountain, his laughter booming over the soft jazz quartet playing in the corner, his 2024 Patek Philippe catching the morning sun as he gestured toward the horizon he believed he owned. I arrived late, a calculated move designed to ensure that the maximum number of eyes would be on me when I entered his sanctum. I was not wearing an apron today, nor was I the girl in the $45 thrift store wrap dress. Instead, I was armored in a structured black blazer from Alexander McQueen that had cost me exactly $1,200, my first true power purchase. The fabric was heavy and uncompromising, the sharp lines of the shoulders giving me a silhouette that commanded space before I even spoke a word. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, severe bun, and my hands, though still marked by the faint, invisible scars of 1,000 bakes, were steady as I gripped the heavy manila folder containing the death warrants of his career. I walked through the crowd of millionaires and power brokers, the sea of silk and cashmere parting as I moved toward the head of the primary table where my father sat like a monarch. He was mid-anecdote, regaling a hedge fund manager with the story of how he had outmaneuvered a competitor in the 90s, a plate of eggs Benedict topped with shaved truffles and a $20 dollop of caviar sitting untouched before him. The scent of the rooftop was a bizarre mixture of salty river air, expensive lily arrangements, and the buttery richness of the hollandaise sauce. I didn't wait for an invitation, nor did I offer a greeting to the brother who sat to his left, already looking at me with a mixture of annoyance and confusion. I reached the head of the table and, with a deliberate, forceful motion, I slammed the heavy manila folder down onto the linen directly next to my father's plate. The sudden, sharp clatter of the paper and cardstock hitting the table silenced the $1,000-a-plate conversation in a heartbeat, the sound echoing off the glass railings and hanging in the cool morning air like a gunshot. The jazz quartet seemed to falter for a second before tapering off into a confused silence, and 60 of the most powerful people in New York turned their heads as one to look at the daughter who had finally decided to stop being a budget error. Alistair looked up at me, his face transitioning from a mask of jovial success to one of deep, simmering irritation, his blue eyes narrowing as he took in my $1,200 blazer and the cold, clinical look on my face. "Cassidy, what on earth is the meaning of this interruption?" he hissed, his voice low but carrying that dangerous edge he used to terrify his junior associates. "We are in the middle of a private celebration, and I believe I told you that your presence was only required if you were bringing the dessert tray." I didn't flinch, and I didn't look away. Instead, I leaned forward, my hands flat on the table, feeling the coolness of the linen through my palms. "I'm not here to serve you sugar, Dad. I'm here to serve you the truth," I said, my voice projecting with a clarity and a resonance that I had spent 3 months practicing in the silence of my Bed-Stuy studio. I watched as Bennett reached for the folder, his fingers twitching with the urge to regain control of the room's narrative, but I pinned the folder down with one hand, my gaze locked on Alistair. "You gave me 12 months to watch my business fail, but I only needed 6 to watch yours crumble," I continued, the words cutting through the silence of the rooftop like a diamond through glass. "Inside that folder, you'll find the notarized deeds for the ground lease of this very building, as well as the wire transfer confirmations from Aura Holdings." He laughed then, a short, barking sound of genuine disbelief, looking around at his guests as if seeking their participation in the joke. "Aura Holdings? Cassidy, don't be absurd," he said, shaking his head. "That's a sophisticated investment vehicle that's been snapping up distressed assets all over the district. You're a pastry chef. You wouldn't know a ground lease from a grocery list." But as he spoke, his eyes drifted down to the top page of the document that had spilled out from the folder, and I saw the moment the color drained from his face. He saw the signature of the Luxembourg bank's liquidator and the specific, unmistakable alphanumeric code of the trust my mother had left me. He saw the stamp of the Cayman Islands authorities, and for the first time in my life, I watched Alistair Sterling lose his breath. The silence on the rooftop was now so profound that I could hear the distant honking of taxis 40 stories below on Water Street. The elite clients, the sharks and the vultures he had spent 30 years cultivating, began to lean in, their professional curiosity overriding their social decorum as they realized they were witnessing a slaughter. Bennett's smirk had completely vanished, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed expression of horror as he realized that the $20 million tech acquisition he had been bragging about was now technically housed in a building where I held the ultimate leverage. I leaned in closer to my father, my voice dropping to a whisper that was intended only for him, though I knew the silence would carry it to everyone nearby. "You called me a tax write-off in front of these people," I reminded him, the memory of the Pierre Hotel gala burning in my mind like a brand. "You told them I lacked the predatory instinct. But while you were busy playing the king on a borrowed throne, I was the one buying the dirt you stand on. This building, the Sterling Plaza, now has a new landlord, and I've already instructed my legal team, led by Julian Vance, to begin a full audit of your leasehold compliance. Every missed payment, every building code violation you've swept under the rug, and every over-leveraged loan you've secured against these walls is about to be brought into the light." I watched his hand tremble as he reached for his water glass, the ice clinking against the crystal with a frantic, metallic rhythm. He wasn't the master of the universe anymore. He was a man who had just realized his daughter was the one holding the keys to his prison. The weather remained a perfect, mocking 55 degrees, the sun shining brightly on the catastrophe of his pride. I stood up straight, smoothing the front of my McQueen blazer, and looked out over the gathered crowd of investors. Many of them were already checking their phones, likely calling their own analysts to verify the news of the ground lease sale or to distance themselves from the radioactive mess that Sterling Holdings was about to become. I had not just evicted my father from his building. I had evicted him from the social and financial ecosystem he spent his life building. I turned back to Alistair, who was staring at the manila folder as if it were a venomous snake. "You have exactly 30 days to vacate the executive suite," I said, using the same cold, detached tone he had used on me for 28 years. "Unless, of course, you'd like to apply for that junior analyst desk you were so keen on preparing for me. I'm sure my firm could find a place for someone with your experience." The irony was a physical weight in the air, a thick, sweet satisfaction that tasted better than any pastry I had ever created. I began to walk away, my heels clicking sharply against the stone tiles of the terrace, each step a declaration of my independence. As I reached the elevator bank, I heard my brother Bennett call out my name, his voice high and desperate, but I didn't stop. I had spent my entire life stopping for them, waiting for them, and shrinking myself so they could feel large. But those days were over. I stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut with a soft, expensive hiss, and as the car began its descent, I felt the pressure of the Sterling name finally lift from my chest. I had used the very tools of his trade, the high-interest loans, the offshore trusts, and the cold-blooded timing, to prove that he was right about one thing: the world doesn't reward hobbies. It rewards assets. And on this crisp morning in Lower Manhattan, I had proven that I was the greatest asset our family had ever produced, and the one he was now destined to lose. I reached into my pocket and felt the iPhone 15 Pro, the recording of his birthday speech still there, a digital anchor to the past that I no longer needed to carry. I had built my own foundation, one made of flour, steel, and a mother's foresight, and it was far stronger than the glass tower I was leaving behind. When the elevator reached the lobby, I walked out into the bustling energy of the street, the real world where people worked and struggled and built things of value. I headed toward my black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe High Country, Elias waiting with the door open and a look of quiet respect on his face. He didn't ask how it went. He didn't have to. The look on my face told the entire story of a revolution that had been won in a single hour. I climbed into the back seat and looked up at the Sterling Plaza, the sun reflecting off its glass surface in a blinding golden glare. It was just a building, I realized, a collection of steel and stone that held no power over me anymore. I was Cassidy Miller, and I had turned a cupcake hobby into a corporate takeover, proving that the most dangerous person in the room is the one you assume has nothing to lose. The victory brunch was over, but my life was finally, truly beginning. And as the Tahoe pulled away from the curb and merged into the flow of the city, I felt a deep, resonant peace. Family isn't a debt you spend your life trying to pay. Family is the strength you find when you realize you owe them nothing at all. I was the architect of my own destiny, and as I looked forward at the road ahead, I knew that the next 12 months wouldn't be about survival. They would be about the glorious, unapologetic construction of a future that belonged entirely to me. The morning sun continued to beat down on the rooftop terrace of the Sterling Plaza, but for Alistair Sterling, the world had just entered a deep, terminal freeze. I stood at the head of the table, the wind catching the lapels of my $1,200 McQueen blazer, and looked directly into the eyes of the man who had spent 28 years trying to make me small. "Dad, you said I lacked the predatory instinct," I said, my voice coming out with a clinical, terrifying steadiness that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the building we stood upon. I didn't wait for him to respond. Instead, I reached into the heavy manila folder and began to slide high-resolution, notarized copies of the new title deed across the linen tablecloth to every single one of the 60 elite guests who had come here to celebrate his 30-year reign. I watched the faces of billionaires and power brokers go pale as they realized they weren't just guests at a brunch, they were witnesses to a summary execution of a dynasty. "You've been leasing the Sterling Plaza from a shell-holding company in Luxembourg that just underwent a forced bank liquidation," I continued, my gaze never wavering from my father's collapsing expression. "While you were busy mocking my pastry business as a cupcake hobby, I was quietly buying up the distressed debt through Aura Holdings. The truth is simple, Alistair. I bought the dirt, I bought the debt, and as of 10 a.m. yesterday, I am officially your landlord." I saw the way his fingers twitched against the silver fork he was still holding, a piece of truffle-topped egg sliding off and staining the white tablecloth. But he seemed paralyzed by the sheer mathematical impossibility of what I was saying. I reached over and flipped the master folder to page 12, stabbing my finger down on section 4, which was highlighted in a fluorescent yellow that looked like a neon sign in the morning light. "I want you to look closely at this specific provision," I said, my tone dripping with a cold, professional irony. The owner occupancy clause was a relic of the original 1985 ground lease, one you obviously failed to read during your last 3 refinancing cycles. It states that the landlord has the right to reclaim the primary commercial square footage if they intend to use the space for their own corporate operations. The Muffin Girl is exercising that clause effective immediately. You have exactly 30 days to vacate 60,000 square feet of prime Class A office space in this tower, or I will be forced to trigger the $5 million default penalty outlined on page 15. The silence that followed was so heavy, it felt as though the roof itself might buckle under the weight of it. At that moment, my brother Bennett, who had been sitting in a state of stunned, slack-jawed silence, made a sudden, jerky movement as if to stand up and protest, but his hand struck his crystal mimosa glass instead. The fragile vessel tipped over, and I watched in slow motion as it hit the stone pavers of the terrace, shattering into 1,000 glittering shards that caught the sunlight. The sound of the breaking glass was the only thing that dared to interrupt my voice, and it felt like the audible cracking of the Sterling reputation. The orange liquid seeped into the grout, a sticky, expensive mess that mirrored the state of my brother's future. He looked down at the ruins at his feet and then back up at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. But no sound came out. He was no longer the golden boy with the $12,000 Rolex. He was just a passenger on a sinking ship, and I was the iceberg he had spent his life pretending didn't exist. My father, meanwhile, couldn't even manage a stutter. His face had turned a peculiar ashen shade of gray that made him look every bit of his 60 years, and then some. He just stared down at the $18.5 million acquisition line on the final page of the deed, his eyes tracing the loops and lines of my signature. It was the same handwriting that had signed his Father's Day cards for decades, but now it was the instrument of his total financial and social displacement. The 60 guests, the very people Alistair had cultivated to be his shield and his audience, were now staring at him with a mixture of pity and predatory interest. In the world of Manhattan real estate, there is nothing more dangerous than a wounded lion, and they could all see the blood in the water. I watched as 3 of his biggest investors quietly stood up, tucked their napkins onto the table, and walked toward the elevators without saying a single word to my father. They didn't need to. The documents I had distributed were a clear signal that the sterling name was now toxic. I felt a surge of something more powerful than revenge. It was a sense of profound architectural completion. I had found the one structural flaw in his life, his belief that I was a non-entity, and I had used it to bring the entire tower down on his head. "You always told me that family was an asset, Dad," I whispered, leaning in so close that I could smell the expensive scotch still lingering on his breath from the night before. "But you forgot that an asset can also be a liability if you don't know how to manage it. I've spent 28 years being your liability, but today I'm the one who's closing the account." The sun was high in the sky now, casting short, brutal shadows across the rooftop. I took a deep breath of the crisp, 55-degree air and felt a lightness in my chest that I hadn't known since I was a child. I wasn't just the girl who chose flour over finance. I was the woman who had used the finance to protect the flour. I looked around the terrace one last time, at the expensive lily arrangements, the silver coffee urns, and the terrified man sitting at the head of a table that no longer belonged to him. I didn't feel a need to gloat or to scream. The silence of his defeat was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I turned away from him and began to walk toward the exit, my black blazer catching the light, my head held higher than it had ever been in the Sterling townhouse. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of the remaining guests as they scrambled to minimize their own exposure to the coming fallout. But I didn't care about them. I was thinking about the 450-square-foot studio in Bed-Stuy, the $4 ramen, and the 14-hour days I had spent prepping tarts with hibiscus-stained fingers. All of that labor had been the foundation for this moment. As I reached the glass doors leading back into the building, I heard my father finally find his voice. "Cassidy!" he called out, his tone cracked and hollow, stripped of all its former authority. "Where are you going?" I stopped for a fraction of a second, my hand on the cool metal handle of the door, but I didn't turn around. "I'm going back to work, Alistair," I said, the name feeling strange and final on my tongue. "I have a bakery to run, and now, apparently, I have 60,000 square feet of office space to renovate. I think it would make an excellent flagship kitchen for Miller and Hearth." I stepped through the doors and into the quiet, air-conditioned interior of the tower, the sound of the rooftop drama fading away behind me. The elevator was waiting, its brass doors polished to a mirror finish, and as I stepped inside, I saw my own reflection. I looked like an architect. I looked like a landlord. Most importantly, I looked like a woman who was no longer waiting for anyone's permission to exist. The descent from the 40th floor was smooth and rapid, a physical manifestation of the speed at which the Sterling dynasty was collapsing. By the time I reached the lobby, the news of the ground lease takeover would already be hitting the private channels of the New York real estate market. My phone began to vibrate in my pocket with a relentless series of notifications. Emails from bankers, texts from Julian Vance, and alerts from the legal team at Aura Holdings. I ignored them all. I walked out into the bright, chaotic energy of Water Street, the sounds of construction and traffic filling my ears like a symphony. I felt the weight of the $18.5 million acquisition not as a burden, but as a solid, immovable base upon which I could build whatever I wanted. My mother's ledger, her secret Cayman trust, and my own tireless work had converged into a single point of absolute triumph. I walked toward my black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe High Country, my boots clicking on the very sidewalk I now owned, and I realized that the 12-month deadline Alistair had set was the greatest gift he had ever given me. He had given me a goal, and in my effort to meet it, I had surpassed him in every way that mattered. I climbed into the back seat and looked out at the city, the skyscrapers reaching toward the clouds like the ambitions of 1,000 different people. I thought about the moral of the story my mother used to tell me, that family isn't the blood that flows through your veins, but the people who stand by you when the world tries to wash you away. Alistair and Bennett had tried to wash me away for 28 years, but all they had succeeded in doing was tempering me into something they couldn't break. I was Cassidy Miller, a professional pastry architect, and I had just designed the most important structure of my life, my own freedom. The Sterling Plaza was no longer a monument to my father's ego. It was a testament to the power of the overlooked. As the Tahoe pulled away from the curb and merged into the midtown traffic, I watched the reflection of the tower disappear in the glass of the neighboring buildings. It was a good day for a revolution. It was a perfect day to start a new legacy, one built on the honest smell of flour and the unbreakable strength of a woman who finally knew her own worth. The 30 days were already counting down, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who had to worry about where I was going to go. I was already home. The fallout from that morning on the rooftop was not a mere business transition. It was a total and absolute financial bloodbath that dismantled 30 years of sterling arrogance in the span of a few fiscal weeks. Within 48 hours of my announcement, the news that Aura Holdings, a ghost entity they couldn't touch, had seized the ground lease of Sterling Plaza sent shockwaves through the New York real estate market. My father's firm, which relied on the stability of its physical headquarters to secure its multi-million-dollar revolving credit lines, suddenly found itself in a state of catastrophic technical default. The primary lenders at J.P. Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs didn't care about Alistair Sterling's legacy or his custom Brioni suits. They cared about the fact that his firm no longer possessed a permanent, secure address from which to operate their collateralized assets. I watched from the quiet sanctuary of my bakery in Chelsea as the dominoes fell exactly as Julian Vance and I had projected in our cold, blue light sessions in Bed-Stuy. The board of directors, men and women who had spent decades nodding at my father's every whim, turned on him with the speed of starving wolves the moment the stock price plummeted 42%. My brother Bennett, who had believed his $12,000 Rolex and his title of senior vice president made him untouchable, was unceremoniously fired by that very board just 14 days after he dropped his mimosa glass on my terrace. They needed a scapegoat for the lack of oversight regarding the leasehold risks, and the golden boy was the easiest head to put on the chopping block. I stayed in my bakery, the smell of burnt sugar and fermenting dough remaining the anchor of my reality. But the world outside my flour-dusted windows had changed irrevocably. I was no longer just the tenant of a small corner on West 18th Street. Through the strategic reinvestment of the Cayman bond and the mounting rental income from the Sterling Plaza, I had successfully executed a quiet acquisition of the entire commercial block. I owned the brick, the mortar, and the very air that my competitors breathed. While my father was busy fielding process servers and dodging calls from the Pierre Hotel's membership office, I was sitting at my scarred wooden desk in the back of the kitchen, drafting a final cold-blooded communication. I sent Alistair Sterling a final itemized invoice for $44,200, categorized specifically as cleaning fees and restorative maintenance for his former executive suite. I included high-resolution photographs of the scuff marks his Italian loafers had left on the mahogany floors and the faint scent of cigar smoke that had permeated the silk wallpaper. A final sting to remind him that in my world, every mess has a price and every debt must be settled in full. There was no room for sentimentality in the ledger I was keeping, and I wanted him to feel the weight of every single dollar he had once claimed I was incapable of earning. The mighty Alistair Sterling, the man who once owned 14% of Lower Manhattan's commercial skyline, is currently residing in a cramped two-bedroom rental apartment in Jersey City. It is a functional, uninspired space with laminate flooring and a view of a parking garage, a far cry from the Swarovski chandeliers of the Pierre Hotel or the limestone townhouse on the Upper East Side. He is living on a fixed liquidation allowance while the bankruptcy courts pick through the carcass of Sterling Holdings, and for the first time in 60 years, he has to check the balance of his checking account before he orders a bottle of wine. Bennett is currently consulting, a polite industry term for being unemployable in the city, where everyone saw him shatter that glass in terror, and the silence from their side of the family is the most beautiful sound I have ever heard. I am no longer the budget error, the disappointment, or the daughter who chose a cupcake hobby over a real career. I am the owner, the landlord, and the architect of a new reality that doesn't require their validation to exist. The 12-month clock my father started ended not with my eviction, but with his obsolescence. The structure of my life is now built on the most stable foundation imaginable, the cold, hard facts of my own labor and the undeniable reality of my success. I wake up at 4 a.m, not because I have to pay a repairman for a broken oven, but because I still love the way the world smells when the first batch of bread comes out of the heat. I walk through my building, the black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe High Country, waiting at the curb to take me to the financial district, where I now oversee the renovation of the Sterling Plaza's 60,000 square feet of office space into the world's most advanced culinary architecture center. Every time I sign a contract or authorize a wire transfer, I think about that night at the Pierre, the 28-degree wind, and the way my father looked at me like I was a ghost. I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't taking his money. It was taking his pride and showing him that the very girl he dismissed had become the predator he always claimed to be. Family, as I have come to learn, isn't about the blood you share or the name on the front of the building. Family is the people who respect the work you put into the world. My mother's leather-bound ledger sits in a glass case in my new office, a reminder of the silent brilliance that Alistair tried to bury, and a testament to the fact that the truth always finds a way to the surface if you're willing to dig for it. I look out over the city from the top floor of the tower I now own, the skyline no longer looking like a threat but like a blueprint I've finally mastered. I think about the hibiscus powder on my fingers and the $45 dress, and I wear those memories like a badge of honor, a reminder of where the steel in my spine actually came from. I have proven that a hobby can build an empire when it's fueled by the precision of an architect and the hunger of someone who has been told they are nothing. The Sterling name may be fading into the fine print of bankruptcy filings, but the name Cassidy Miller is etched into the very dirt of Manhattan. I am the one who stayed, the one who built, and the one who finally locked the doors on the past. As I watch the sun set over the Hudson River, casting long golden shadows across the office that used to be a throne room for a man who didn't know his own daughter, I feel a sense of completion that no bank balance could ever provide. I am the master of my own square footage, the curator of my own destiny, and the final authority on my own worth. The cleaning fees have been paid, the vacancies have been filled, and the oven is working perfectly. There is a deep, resonant peace in knowing that I never had to become like them to beat them. I just had to be myself, only louder, sharper, and more precise than they ever anticipated. The journey from the foyer of the townhouse to the head of the boardroom table was paved with flour and fire, and I wouldn't change a single agonizing step of it. I am Cassidy Miller, and I have officially evicted the ghosts of my father's expectations from my life forever. The story of the Sterling dynasty is over, but the story of what a daughter can build in the ruins of a father's ego is only just beginning, and the foundation is more solid than anything he ever dreamed of constructing. I look at the time on my 2024 Patek Philippe, a gift to myself for the acquisition anniversary, and I smile. It's exactly the right time for a new beginning. In the end, it wasn't the $18.5 million that changed me. It was the realization that I had the power to change the world around me all along. My father's 12-month deadline was a cage he built for me, but he forgot that an architect knows how to find the exit in any structure. I walked out of that cage and turned it into his prison, not out of malice, but out of a necessity for balance. The world is a cold place for those who don't have a plan, but for those of us who know how to measure, weigh, and time every movement, it is a place of endless possibility. I am no longer looking for a seat at their table because I have built my own, and the guest list is strictly limited to those who understand that value is created by hands, not just by ledgers. The lights of the city are flickering on, a million tiny witnesses to the new era of Miller and Hearth, and as I close my manila folder for the last time today, I know that the truth is the only asset that never depreciates. I am the owner of the block, the landlord of the legacy, and the woman who finally proved that the most artisan project of all is the life you build for yourself when everyone else tells you it's impossible. My father is in Jersey, my brother is in limbo, and I am exactly where I was always meant to be, at the center of a world I designed myself, brick by brick and loaf by loaf. The cleaning is done, the air is clear, and the future is mine.